Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Antonio Damasio. Antonio is a neurologist and neuroscientist and is currently Professor of Psychology, Philosophy and Neurology at the University of Southern California. His research focuses on the role of emotion in mental processes with a particular focus on consciousness. He's the author of many books, the most recent of which is Feeling and Knowing. Today we discuss how consciousness relates to brains and to the life process. Hope you enjoy the conversation. So I'd like to start by welcoming you to the podcast. I really appreciate you making the time.
My pleasure. Yeah.
So you've focused in your career on the relevance of emotion and bodily feeling with a reference to the brain and consciousness. And this has been a kind of neglected area. You know, there's a lot of focus on cognition and thought. What led you to actually studying feeling and seeing that as central?
Well, I'm not sure I can tell what led me to study feeling in particular. It was something that I obviously was interested in quite early in my scientific career, although the very beginning of my scientific career had much more to do with language. I was very interested in language, and for many years, I studied patients with aphasia, patients that had lost their full language capacity due to strokes. But during that period, because I trained primarily as a neurologist, and both as a neurologist and as a neuroscientist, I had the opportunity of seeing quite intriguing cases that probably made me interested in what happened to affect, what happened to emotions and feelings after certain kinds of stroke. But it may have been another line of interest which comes from my interest in literature and cinema and the problems that have to do with affect, emotion and feeling have always been interesting to me. I didn't know when I was 15 or 20 that I was going to dedicate a good part of my life to their study, but I didn't know either that I was going to become a neuroscientist. So, you know, those things are sometimes a little bit mysterious. Certainly, one of the things that was so intriguing to me was to deal with the distinction between what belongs to reason and what belongs to affect, and of course, like most people of my generation, probably even your generation, we were brought up with the idea that reason is the very powerful aspect and the most civilized aspect, or allows for the most civilized aspects of our behavior. And that emotions are something that ought to be a little bit hidden or at least controlled, and that feeling is something that reveals weaknesses of humans. That was an interesting part of one's growing up in the culture that I grew up in, that you did as well, and then it was quite intriguing to see that there were patients that had serious problems of reasoning, serious problems of decision making, but who quite interestingly were quite capable in terms of the mechanics of reasoning. Where they were not so well, or where they were actually quite impaired, was in what pertained to their affect, to their emotions and their feelings. And so that was quite intriguing, because it was not possible to account for that with the traditional views that emotions and feelings are something minor and something actually somewhat primitive, and that reasoning and calculation are the masters of our minds, and certainly the masters of our fates. humanly and socially. So I think that was probably a significant part of my interest, although in retrospect, I don't see it as I don't see any break in my interests for different aspects of the human mind and of the human brain.
Right. Yeah, I think you're totally right that wider culture being interested in technology, things like artificial intelligence, all of these ways of doing things more cleverly has fed into neuroscience research. And there's the kind of obsession with thinking about the brain as a computer, as this thing disassociated from the body. And I think, you correctly identify the relevance of homeostasis and the kind of bodily life process in understanding the brain, right?
Yes, and of course you're of course a young man, so you immediately think about the current times, and you're thinking about artificial intelligence and about technology and about the dominance of computational aspects in our life, but this actually antecedes all of this sort of current state of things, and it's something that you can go in and look for in traditional philosophy and traditional ways of thinking. And as you probably know, I wrote many years ago in the 90s. I wrote a book called Descartes' Error, which was the title is a bit joking, but it was really about this paying less attention to the world of affect than to the world of reasoning. And so it's a very old problem, and it antecedes all the spectacular developments of engineering and technology of our time. So that's interesting to see that the what has happened with technology has actually reinforced the traditional thinking, and so it's given it some kind of support and even justification, and so the problem continues. Although, contrary to what happened, for example, when I was growing up scientifically, say in the 80s and 90s, there has been progress, and there's been clearly an acknowledgement that affect is important, an acknowledgement that you cannot deal, for example, with psychiatric illness without knowing about affect, and even now I think sort of belatedly the realization that you cannot deal with the culture as it stands, for example, with social and political problems, without paying attention to the world of affect. The idea that this whole our life currently is about reason and laws is just silly, because it isn't. In fact, laws are not being obeyed precisely for very important affective reasons that have to do, for example, with fear and with anger, and nothing to do with reason. So that's actually a very good example of the enormous importance of affect in our lives, and how it is probably not very wise to try to cope with humanity without factoring in this huge aspect, which is human affect.
Right. It'd be good to focus on your kind of thoughts on the role of affect, feeling, emotion in the origins of consciousness, because you draw this picture from homeostasis and the basic survival imperative of life forms all the way to consciousness in brains, right?
Correct. And these are things that especially in my two most recent books. One book that is called The Strange Order of Things, which I'm sure you know, and that's from about 3 or 4 years ago. And then my current book, which is called Feeling and Knowing, and that is very focused on consciousness. And it is focused also on something you just mentioned, homeostasis, which is in fact the grounding for all the thinking on feeling and on consciousness. And homeostasis is simply about, it's a strange word, but it simply refers to life regulation and to the spontaneous and automatic processes with which living organisms regulate their lives. It doesn't make any difference whether you're talking about bacteria or talking about complex creatures like us. We need to obey the rules of homeostasis. And so our metabolism is governed by homeostasis. There are a lot of parameters of our life that need to be within certain bounds. So temperature, for example, things that have to do with our blood pressure, with the way our blood circulates, the presence of certain molecules, but within certain ranges. They cannot be too much or too little. All of that, the many parameters, the combination of which constitute life regulation. And so the creatures, again, as simple as unicellular creatures, or as complicated as we are, need to have these multiple parameters, and we're talking not about one or two, but literally hundreds of parameters that need to be within a certain scale, within a certain maximum and a certain minimum. And what has happened that is so intriguing is that most of that regulation is done non-consciously. So when bacteria or other simple organisms regulate their lives in terms of acquiring sources of energy or defending themselves or procuring a place that is better in terms of temperature so that they can survive better. All of that regulation is by and large done non-consciously. So people are, no, not people, creatures are doing, and people too, are doing intelligent things, but they're doing intelligent things not knowing that they're doing those intelligent things. And there are lots of gestures that I can have that will happen automatically, and I may be protecting themselves by moving away from a hot spot to a colder spot, but I don't need to do that consciously. However, there are certain things that you need to do consciously, and lo and behold, nature was very prodigal and endowed us at a certain point in the history of evolution with this marvelous thing called feeling. So I want to call attention, and that's what I'm totally devoted to in my last book, in Feeling and Knowing, to the point that feelings are spontaneous events in our history, in the history of our development, and they were novel events in the history of evolution. And when feelings first arose, they obviously created quite a stir in the true sense of the term, and they completely changed the way that life was regulated and operated. And what they did was, in fact, inaugurating a new form of life regulation, which allowed for deliberation, allowed for knowledge on the part of the organism that needs to be regulated. And they also inaugurated consciousness. So this is something that is a fact, and it's my interpretation of the fact, but the fact that feelings are conscious spontaneously and automatically is a fact. It's not something that I need to prove in a laboratory. So when you when we creatures first had hunger or thirst or pain or a sense of well-being or desire, all of these feelings, which I call homeostatic feelings, which is, of course, you will understand very well since you know what homeostasis is, all of that was a natural manifestation of consciousness. And that's where consciousness began. Now, this is very important for you and for those who watch your program, because most of the time, the thinking about consciousness has come from exactly the opposite end. People have conceived as, philosophers, for example, and earlier scientists dealing with consciousness, they thought, well, this is such a spectacular world, the world of our minds, of our intellects, the fact that we have this knowledge of ourselves, that this, of course, came from the top and came from big brains that generated this full capacity. And this, unfortunately, is the wrong way to start the conversation. To me, it starts very humbly and very early, and it starts once creatures are complicated enough that they need some kind of coordination for their operations, which requires a brain. Because nervous systems, you see, came into being as a result of a need for coordination. Creatures that had more complicated nervous systems that could, or had nervous systems to begin with, that could coordinate one organ with another and different organs and different systems so that they operated for the good of a single organism. Those creatures were the ones that were selected in evolution and were passed on. And at some point, once there was this enough complexity and there were nervous systems, feelings came into the picture. And that's, it's like opening a curtain into a large stage. And that's the possibility of knowing, wait a minute, there's this feeling of hunger. I need to procure food, or thirst, and I need to procure water, and pain, which will alert me to something that, if it goes on unchecked, may lead to my demise, and I may die from some sickness or wound or whatever. So this is really the important message, is the message that feelings arose out of the presence of complex organisms that had a nervous system, and it was this sort of lightning chance of giving consciousness, giving knowledge to something that was happening in the organism, in the inside. And by the way, just to complete my sort of long answer to your question, this did not happen in human beings first. Obviously, many creatures before us were contemplated with the possibility of feeling and thus consciousness. And it's perfectly obvious when you look around that there are plenty of organisms that are conscious of their pain and of their thirst and hunger and desire. So we came late into this. And then, of course, we created something truly spectacular, which is a better and more complex organization of our minds with multiplicities of images and so forth. And of course, we have given all of those images this power of reference to our singular organism, which is the thing that consciousness does so well. I am conscious. What does it really mean that I'm conscious of myself? It means that the stuff that I have in my mind, my thoughts, my reasonings, my perceptions of whatever sensory channel, all of that is placed within my singular organism. It's part of my body, It's part of me. That is the gist of consciousness. It's the creation of a connection between what's in the mind and what's in the body. It's this true embodiment of mind that comes out of feeling, because it is feeling that is telling you and telling me right now that this stuff that you're listening to and that I'm talking about is actually occurring in our respective organisms and not in some other organism. Because that's, again, something that people very often, in the desire to be, I guess, accurate and complete, people define consciousness in extremely erudite and complicated fashions. Consciousness is about referring our minds to ourselves, period.
So in this picture, you have objective bodily reactions as an organism moves away from homeostatic balance. And I think you reserve the word emotion for that, something that can be observed from the outside. And then Correct. You get nervous systems that can map these states. And through this process, you get the corresponding subjective feeling, right? You get consciousness that corresponds to the emotion because it's being related through the nervous system to the self, to the organism.
Exactly, yeah. And it's very interesting that when you bring the word emotion, and you're clearly aware of the distinction that I make between emotions and feelings. Feelings really are subjective states. But my feelings are not known to you unless I tell you what my feelings are. But I can hide them. It's not necessary that I betray my feelings. They may, but not necessarily. I can hide them. But I cannot hide my emotions. If I'm angry or if I'm full of joy, that will be seen in the collection of actions that go on in my face and in my body. And you will see them. So it's theater, it's public. So what is interesting is that there are feelings that, to begin with, came out of the interior of my body. Nobody saw them, and they created something in my mind. And people don't know about it, although sometimes you can, like, for example, somebody who is hungry or thirsty or in pain will also show exterior signs of that. So there is a feeling, and then there's an action that goes together with it. But then what is so interesting is that when you have emotions, the ones that, so for example, you read something about a political event that absolutely infuriates you, and you are angry about it, or you hear something that makes you fearful, your face transmits that. And so there, the beginning of the story is a certain mental event that leads to a certain deployment of actions. And lo and behold, those actions, because they change the body, are then felt in terms of how they change the body. So you have these different ways of starting the story. You can start from metabolism in the interior of your body and generate a feeling that is totally subjective and not known to anyone else. Or you can start with an idea that triggers an automatic reaction. There comes the actions of the theater. And then, because of those producing changes in the body, you end up feeling them as an emotional feeling as opposed to a homeostatic feeling. Of course, the key issue here is the fact that there is a body that serves as a sort of theater. It's a stage, and things can happen there. And when they happen there, they can be, to some degree, visible by others, and definitely visible by the subject, or visible from the point of view of the subject that owns that organism.
Right. And in this picture, the necessity of nervous systems relates to this concept you deploy of mental images. Could you explain what those are and their relevance to consciousness?
Right. So the concept of mental images is very important, and of course, mental images. We have them galore. Right now, I'm having an image of my iPad on my desk, and there you are in the center of it. This is an image, and I have the image of the rest of my study, or I look outside and I see the image of the Bel Air in Los Angeles. What this is a creation of patterns, in this case, visual, that are being created thanks to the possibility of generating maps, generating mappings, first in our retinas, and then through signaling from the retinas through a very complicated system of cables into visual cortices. And this is something that has been now worked up in great detail. We had marvelous scientists like David Hubel and Thorsten Wiesel, who were able to do a lot of the mapping that comes from our gorgeous retinas, which are really, the retinas are sort of an extrusion of the nervous system into the eyeball. It's really nervous system that came out and stuck out into the eyeball, and then through the optic nerve, this cabling system will bring it into the visual cortices. But what you see when you look at the structure, it's very interesting because it's a plane where you have all of these ends of neurons, and because of the different ways in which light plays on our retinas, we have the possibility of creating maps. Pretty much like if you had a pencil or a brush, you could be drawing stuff on a canvas, and that is being moment by moment literally drawn into the retina and then transmitted through a very beautiful engineering system into a variety of visual cortices that then can do different aspects of the analysis of the form, of the color, of the depth, and so forth. So images, this is a very good example of how images are constructed. And of course, right now, you are listening to me, and here I am producing a variety of sounds in time, and those sounds are being analyzed in your cochlea, and you're listening to all of this, and you're doing exactly the same thing, except that it's, whereas with vision, there's a very clear relationship that you observe immediately between what's in the scene and what's in your internal picture. And with sound, it's a little bit more complicated to imagine, but the same thing happens with sound or olfaction or touch, as I touch, for example, this object. So you create all of these mappings, and then you bring those mappings into the central nervous system, and you generate what I call mental images. So mental images are the result of the operations of these different systems. And of course, you have systems that are also looking into your own organism and also create images that come via interoception. And there, it's interesting because the relationship is different. The systems that look into the outside are extremely precise, or at least more precise than the ones that look into the inside. The ones that look into the inside are of a different evolutionary generation, and they are certainly far less subtle, far less worked on, because the neurons are older. They're neurons that don't have axons with myelin protection, and there are lots of things that make the system that creates images of our interior, a very different system. But probably the most important thing is that the images of our interior are generated in this very strange, commingled way. When I look outside, or I look at you, I'm making a picture of something that is outside of me, no question. But when I'm making a picture of, say, suppose I have a gastric ulcer and I would have pain from it, there is the making of a picture, but that picture is being made from my insides into my nervous system. And because one thing is inside the other, there's the possibility of cross communication. And that's one of the things that people have systematically not paid attention to. And it's one of the things that is most important in the way I've explained things, is that you cannot equate the relationship that I have with the outside world with the relationship that I have with my own organism, because my nervous system is inside my organism. And by the way, it's there as a late arrival in evolution, and it's there to serve my organism. It's not that our body serves our brain. No. It's our brain that is serving our body, and it's helping us maintain life through a variety of things, such as, for example, alerting us to pain or alerting us to good things. So it's the making of images, to get back to your question, the making of images is something that the nervous system has been in charge of through the possibility of mappings, and the mappings have become better and better and better, all the way from commingled old stuff that you get from your interior to the very fine stuff that you get from the outside world.
Right. And can you imagine a scenario in which the relevant mechanisms for consciousness they exist in organisms without nervous systems? Are you certain of the necessity of this mapping process?
I think that consciousness as we know it requires a nervous system. I don't know what the point would be. Of course, it would be very convenient for bacteria to know what they were doing, I imagine, except that how would they do it? They have one cell, they have one little organism. It needs to have homeostasis regulated within that cell. It's very simple, but I don't see in that creature, anatomically or physiologically, anything that could resemble the things that your nervous system or mine are doing right now, which is really representing stuff and having the possibility of manipulating those representations and having the possibility of joining those representations in novel ways that can be meaningful. There's nothing in those little creatures that could possibly do this. There's no engineering stuff. They just lack that possibility, and they do very well. Thank you. They don't need it. They don't have it. They don't have it because they don't need it. They don't need it because they don't have it. It all goes together very nicely.
Right. And then on the issue of the consciousness emerging with the mental images, how seriously do you take the hard problem of consciousness in this context? So this suggestion that no such explanation would actually be able to account for subjective states.
Well, I don't think it's a good formulation at all. I've referred to it as an abstraction more than a statement of a problem. I don't think that there's a hard problem of consciousness. I think, with due respect to my colleague David Chalmers, I think it's a very nice way of putting it. And there was a time in which maybe it made sense because there was quite a lot. It's interesting historically when when you look at the end of the 20th century, people got more and more interested in consciousness because, of course, we were dealing with perception, we were dealing with all sorts of different and complicated aspects of nervous system, such as memory, all of the decision making, all of these different functions that were so mysterious and suddenly started falling apart in terms of mystery, and they were revealed, and in very substantial ways. And so people were also interested in consciousness, and this is especially in the 80s and 90s, people were very devoted to the problem, but finding enormous difficulties in conceptualizing it. And so at a certain point, it was probably expedient to say, well, let's divide this into the simple problems and the hard problems, the easy and the hard, and then at a certain point have this lapidary statement or bet even that you would never find would never account for how consciousness was made, especially in the sense of how one could have experiences. And I think that's not the case. I think that we can account for experiences, but maybe it called attention to the problem, and that's a virtue. But I don't think, and it's sort of in the end, other than being a device, I don't think it's very credible, because all the mysteries of science that we have been confronting for centuries now have been falling, by the wayside. We have been able to cope with all of these mysteries in a very effective way. So it would be a bit strange that consciousness would not fall as well. It doesn't have to be. We hypervalue it, probably for good reasons, but I don't think that's the case. The other thing too is that the heart problem has probably made people flee biology under the idea that biology could not cope with the problem of consciousness. So if you're going to understand consciousness, you better hide somewhere else. And one of the ways people are hiding right now is with panpsychism, and say that this pencil is a little bit conscious, and this desk is a little bit conscious, and the stones and the air and so forth. And again, the serious problems with this. First, it's not very convincing, even at the outset. But then, how would you test for this? How would you, if you're a scientist, how are you going to do the experiments? I can, if I say that something called homeostatic feelings, and I define it, I can go to the laboratory and study how organisms can generate those feelings. I can study it in humans up to a certain point. I can then go to experimental animals that have similar structures and ask questions about how it's done. What are the molecules? What are the parts of the nervous system that are engaged in this? What is the contribution of the body? But how am I going to study the idea that even stones are conscious? What are the experiments that we're going to do? That really is a problem.
Right. And to end on, I've in some of your writing, where you're writing about the necessity of the sense of self for consciousness, there was a passage where you said that without a sense of self, there would be no one to know the feelings, there would be no consciousness. I wondered what your take is on meditative experiences where people lose their sense of self, but they still have consciousness.
Oh, if I understand your question correctly, let's agree on the fact that we have very different states of consciousness and very different ways of being. Just to give clear examples, you can, if you need to have, you're not going to allow the surgeon to cut into your body without having anesthesia. And so with the simple rapid injection of a molecule, and you start counting backwards, and all of a sudden you were there, and the next instant you're not there. Consciousness was suspended. And consciousness was suspended in very, very drastic ways. Something happens that is comparable when you faint. You may hit your head, consciousness goes. Something happens every night when you sleep. And there you have a much bigger variety of states, some of which are of no consciousness whatsoever, and some of which are of conscious but modified, as you have in dreaming. You are conscious of that, or you would not have the experience, you would not have the possibility of even remembering it. And yet, it's a very different world in which you combine images in ways that do not respect reality. And of course, you then have experiences that you can have in deep meditative states, which again don't conform to the day-to-day. So all of these are ways of interfering with how the nervous system, together with the body, is constructing experience. And it's one very powerful set of data to show how biological the thing is, how much this is the result of this interaction between nervous system and body, living body, and how it can be rapidly adjusted with the simple action of something like a certain molecule, the molecule of an anesthetic, or the even simpler way in which you fall asleep and you enter different stages of sleep with different arrangements of the brain, because the nervous system is operating in different ways during all those stages. It's a very, very powerful set of natural examples. Well, anesthesia is not natural, but certainly fainting after a concussion or falling asleep are absolutely natural examples.
Well, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cook.